Hello and welcome to another TLDR EU video that's absolutely getting demonetized for discussing drugs. Portugal has made a bit of a name for itself when it comes to drug policy, because it's one of only a small number of countries to decriminalize certain drugs all the way back to the early 2000s. This might sound like a wild idea, decriminalizing drugs, but many advocates think that it's a model that should be followed by other countries. Anyway, in this video we're going to explain what led Portugal to take such radical steps, the actual policies that have been enacted, as well as the changes that these new laws have made. Then we'll take a look around the EU and see how other countries handle drug misuse. Before we do though, and as I said up front, this video is without a doubt getting demonetized, so we have to pay our bills. So if you want to help support the channel, then you should consider grabbing one of our Portugal enamel pin badges, featuring the iconic countries with shoes design. Or if Portugal's not your bag, then we have one for every EU country, as well as a whole bunch of other countries too. The link to the store's in the description, and if you use code NOADVERTS, then you'll get 10% off your order. While some countries might decide to ignore contentious drug misuse situations, Portugal didn't have that luxury. Looking at EU countries in 1999, there were 15 at the time, Portugal's drug-induced AIDS rates were the highest. It also sat second on the list of HIV diagnoses for people with substance use disorders. Alongside this, the country was dealing with rising deaths as a result of overdose, as well as rising rates of tuberculosis, hepatitis B and hepatitis C, all of which are associated with drug misuse. So, pretty obviously, Portugal was in the midst of a worrying situation. The government, led by Antonio Guterres of the Socialist Party, wanted to sort this out, and thus commissioned research into some potential policy ideas, with the group in charge ultimately suggesting decriminalization, amongst some other options. The government decided to go with this strategy, choosing to decriminalize all types of drugs in the country. This meant that while drugs aren't legal, the sanctions for misuse are civil rather than criminal. Think of it as a bit like a speeding ticket, although we'll come to the exact response from law enforcement later in the video. However, despite decriminalization, there is still a limit on the volume of drugs a person can be in possession of for it not to be deemed a criminal offence. This is to make sure that practices such as drug dealing and trafficking are still firmly responded to. That's because drugs are still acquired illegally, but it's the person who supplies the drugs who's considered a criminal, rather than the person in possession of the drugs, as long as their possession is below said limit. Another major change went alongside the decriminalization, and that was the creation of the Commission for the Dissuasion of Drug Addiction. Assuming that a person was in possession of less than the aforementioned limit, they were asked to attend a hearing by the committee, which then decides the necessary next steps, as opposed to putting someone in jail or in front of a jury. The interesting part of this is that for the most part, the committee doesn't suggest any concrete measures, as pretty much all of the people who are sent to it aren't seen to be using drugs in a way that harms them. So basically the process just ends there. 81% of hearings in 2011 were simply dealt with by the committee. The people who the committee are actually worried about are offered rehabilitation, but the uptake of this is completely down to the individual person and cannot be enforced. Basically, the whole process puts the onus on rehabilitation as opposed to imprisonment or other penalties. Before we move on though, let's quickly jump back to the people who are in possession of more than the allowed limit of the substance. For them, law enforcement are given the power to decide if the person is actually trafficking or just carrying more than is allowed, and subsequently they decide the best course of action from this point. Naturally though, there are some ethical concerns that go along with this. This system of letting law enforcement decide impacts people from ethnic minorities and poorer backgrounds much more than the dominant groups in society. Although we're focusing on Portugal, if we take the US as an example, even though black and white people have an equal chance of using drugs, black people are 3 times more likely to be arrested. There's a similar issue in Portugal, where since the uptake of the whole policy, foreign nationals have been much more likely to be deemed as trafficking and imprisoned than native Portuguese. There are plenty of other important strands to these new policies though, besides simply decriminalising and dissuasion. The changes proposed to the government also came with suggestions for increased prevention and treatment services, as well as better harm reduction and social integration initiatives. So that's the ins and outs of the actual policy, but has it actually had the desired impact? Well, we're going to split this analysis into levels of drug misuse and the wider impact on people's well-being. Firstly, and quite simply, while critics have pointed out that casual experimentation with drugs has gone up, harmful drug misuse has fallen since the enactment of Portugal's drug transformation. Secondly, there's been a positive impact on health too. For example, deaths by overdose have fallen by 80%. HIV/AIDS diagnoses attributed to drug misuse fell massively, from 52% to 6%, and drug-related prison sentences dropped by 40%. On the face of it, it looks like pretty good progress, but there is always doubt as to whether the correlation here actually implies causality. In other words, did the drug policy cause the positive outcomes, or is there more to it? Well, some have argued that when it came to drugs, Portuguese culture had been changing anyway in the years prior. It's thought that attitudes were altering regardless, and the argument goes that the drug policies of the early 2000s just enforced how people already felt. It's also been argued that the way the police were acting years before legislation change was more liberal anyway, so when the laws were introduced, practically very little changed. Anyway, the Obama White House also produced a critical study looking at a report on Portuguese policies. For example, it found that deaths were already falling prior to the new policies, and despite a decrease in deaths after reaching the statute book, they increased again in 2007. The White House report also found that drug misuse of certain substances rose, some more generally, but others especially in the 15 to 35 age bracket. That being said though, the Drug Policy Alliance provides more up-to-date data and shows that overall, drug misuse has not gone up, and harmful use and deaths have both fallen. As we noted earlier, harm reduction is a crucial aspect of this drug policy. Harm reduction can include things like needle exchange programs, changing a used needle for a clean one, supervised drug consumption rooms, and opioid agonist therapy. While Portugal does offer some of these facilities, others it's failed to offer. For example, it took until 2019 for them to open the first supervised drug consumption facilities, showing that even they weren't fully following the advice they'd been issued. Right, so that's a look at what's happening in Portugal, but what about other countries in the EU? Traditionally, drug laws around the world have been very strict, and this remains the case in many countries worldwide, with the strictest penalties even including death. However, despite Portugal being maybe the country who's received the most attention for its liberal drug policies, there are actually 30 countries around the world that have decriminalised the possession of at least some drugs. 19 have decriminalised all drugs in some way, and 9 of these are in the EU. These decriminalizations vary. For example, Spain has decriminalised all drugs, and doesn't fine people if they're in private, but it still enforces fines for public possession. These fines can be quite tough, and ultimately affect those who have substance use disorders the most, who also are often the ones who don't have the money to pay such high fines. On the other end of the spectrum is the Czech Republic, where the stigmatization of people with substance use disorders is low, and while there are still fines, the system tends to focus on treatment rather than punishment. Focusing on the EU then, we thought it'd be a good idea to look at the countries with the most drug misuse and see which policies they pursued in comparison to Portugal. According to the most recent data from 2018, 14.65 people per 1,000 in Denmark were classed as having substance use disorders. In this case, meaning injecting or regular use of opioids, cocaine, or amphetamines. This was followed by Finland at 10.69, Portugal at 10.12, and Latvia at 9.37. Let's take a look at how they attempt to deal with the worrying situations, focusing on individual misuse rather than trafficking. In Denmark, illegal possession for personal use usually results in a fine, the size of which varies depending on the type and quantity of drugs involved and prior offences. Imprisonment is possible for smaller drug possession, but happens usually only for the more serious situations, and for those people who are in more troubling situations, there's actually the potential for treatment to be offered instead. In Finland, again, it's feasible that someone could be imprisoned even for minor possession, but in practice, enforcement is normally more liberal for smaller possessions. However, those apprehended multiple times can still get prison time. Latvia has a more liberal policy than Finland and Denmark. Possession of smaller amounts generally results in a fine, and there are various ways of handling repeated harmful use, ranging from shortish prison sentences to suspended sentences with treatment offered. When it comes to harm reduction facilities, all three nations offer some kind. Latvia and Finland provide needle and syringe programs, while Denmark offers this as well as drug consumption rooms in some places, naloxone, which decreases the chance of overdose, and heroin-assisted treatment. While these three nations we've discussed have clearly made some effort to invest in harm reduction in order to support those with substance use disorders, drugs are very much still illegal and criminalised. It's fair to say that looking at the stats, this policy isn't working. That's not to say that decriminalization is some form of silver bullet. As we saw earlier, Portugal still has comparably high rates of substance use disorders, even if they have fallen and death rates are relatively low. The Czech Republic, though, which as we said earlier, has quite a non-stigmatized attitude, does seem to have relatively low rates of drug misuse, especially high-risk opioid misuse. That's certainly interesting and suggests that decriminalization might be working, but without a deeper dive into the Czech Republic and other nations, it would be difficult to say whether this was down to their drug policies or other factors. When it comes down to it though, the thing that seems to be highlighted by experts as the most important is addressing the issue of treatment and a change in attitudes or destigmatization towards people with substance use orders, whether these things are accompanied by decriminalization or not. So there you have it, a look at Portugal's famous drug policies, and a brief comparison to other countries in the EU. Do you think that these decriminalisation efforts actually have an impact, or are they wrong, with punishment being the best course of action, rather than rehabilitation? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that's in the description.